But when I said Michael, you probably forgot it. You said, I'd love that.
Yeah.
It's such a great name. You worn it well.
Bill Gaither, a beloved gospel music legend and influential figure, found himself in the middle of a shocking and unforgettable moment today. The courtroom, usually filled with the hum of legal jargon and calm deliberation, suddenly grew tense as the judge prepared to deliver the sentence. As Gaither stood there, his face a mix of anticipation and dread. No one could have predicted what was about to unfold. The words that followed seemed to freeze the air, heavy with the gravity of what was being said. In an instant his expression changed from shock to something far more alarming. Before anyone could fully process the situation, Bill Gaither collapsed right there in the center of the courtroom as his legs gave way beneath him. What could have caused such a visceral reaction? Was it the weight of the sentence itself, or something more personal? The room fell into a stunned silence as people rushed to his side, the situation unfolding faster than anyone would have expected. This unexpected turn of events has everyone questioning the true story behind Gaither's collapse and the harsh reality he now faces. The end of an era for Bill Gaither. The news about Bill Gaither's legal troubles hit the gospel music world like a lightning bolt. For years he was known as a man of faith, a leader in Christian music, someone who brought people together through powerful songs and messages of hope. But now his name is making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Instead of standing on stage with a mic in his hand, he's standing in a courtroom facing serious accusations that could change his life forever. So what's he being accused of? Well, the list is long and the details are messy. Prosecutors claim that for years Gaither was involved in financial fraud, embezzlement, and tax evasion. They say that the money fans donated to his ministry, money that was supposed to go toward helping others, spreading faith, and supporting Christian outreach programs, was actually going straight into his personal bank account. According to the allegations, he used those funds to live a life of luxury, buying expensive properties, taking extravagant trips, and even making shady business deals behind the scenes. And that's not all. Former employees and even some close friends have come forward saying they saw things that didn't add up. Some reported that money was constantly disappearing, while others claimed they were pressured to stay quiet when they started asking questions. One insider even said, "We knew something wasn't right, but no one wanted to believe it." How could someone like Bill Gaither, someone we all looked up to, be involved in something so dishonest? The case took an even wilder turn when investigators found offshore accounts linked to Gaither's name. Now, if you don't know what that means, offshore accounts are basically hidden bank accounts in other countries where people store money to avoid paying taxes or to keep certain transactions secret. Prosecutors say this proves that Gaither was intentionally hiding money from the government and from his own followers. His legal team, of course, is denying everything. They say the whole thing is a misunderstanding, that the money was being used for legitimate ministry work, and that the offshore accounts were set up for international projects. But the prosecutors aren't buying it. They claim there's too much evidence, too many missing funds, and too many people speaking out for this to be just a mix-up. And then the most shocking moment of all happened right in the middle of the courtroom as the judge prepared to announce his sentence. Gaither suddenly collapsed. Some say it was from the stress of the trial, while others think it was a last-ditch effort to delay the inevitable. Either way, paramedics rushed and cameras were flashing, and for a few minutes no one knew what was going to happen next. Now the big question is, what happens next? Will Gaither be sentenced to Years in prison, or will he somehow walk away with just a slap on the wrist? His most loyal fans still believe in him, saying he's being unfairly targeted and that God will clear his name, but others feel deeply betrayed, wondering how someone they trusted could let them down. Like this, one thing is certain: Bill Gaither's career will never be the same again, whether he's guilty or innocent. This scandal has already left a stain on his legacy that won't be forgotten anytime soon. I think you need to be informed on subjects if you want to quote unquote take a standing. The weight of the moment. Bill Gaither's silent struggle. Bill Gaither sat in the courtroom, his hands clasped tightly together, his eyes locked on the wooden table in front of him. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, heavier than anything he had ever carried before. This was not the stage where he had spent decades performing. This was not a place where music and faith could ease the tension. This was real, unforgiving, cold, and irreversible beside him, but even she could not control what was about to happen. He wanted to reach for her hand to say something, anything that would reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. He had spent his life standing before crowds, delivering messages of inspiration, but here now in this moment he had never felt so alone. The murmurs in the courtroom had stopped. The judge cleared his throat, signaling that the verdict was moments away. Bill inhaled sharply, steadying himself, though he wasn't sure if he was ready. Was anyone ever truly ready for a moment like this? The courtroom had become a cage, trapping him in an unthinkable reality. The bright lights and roaring applause of his past performances seemed like a distant memory, now replaced by the cold, clinical atmosphere of a trial that had turned his life upside down. His thoughts briefly drifted to his fans, those who had stood by him for decades. Were they still out there? Were they watching this unfold? Were they waiting to defend him? Or had they already turned away? The idea of letting them down hurt more than anything else. The media had had a field day with this case. Headlines had plastered his name everywhere, each one more sensational than the last. Every detail of his life had been dissected, analyzed, and judged by strangers who had never met him, never spoken to him, never known his heart. The whispers of betrayal, the accusations, the shock that had rippled through the gospel community, it had all felt surreal at first, but now, sitting here staring at the judge, feeling the tension rising with each passing second, there was no escaping the truth of his reality. His legal team had done all they could. The arguments had been made, the defense had been given, but this was no longer in his hands. His fate belonged to the man seated behind the bench, to the justice system, to whatever forces had led him here. The judge took a deep breath, his face unreadable. Bill clenched his fists, bracing himself for the words that would come next. The final verdict, the decision that could strip him of everything he had built, was about to be spoken. Time seemed to slow, the walls of the courtroom closing in around him. He had sung about faith in the darkest of times, but now, as he sat there, waiting for judgment, he silently asked himself, would his faith be enough to carry him through this? The judge's verdict, a sentence that shook the gospel world. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension, as Judge Harrison adjusted his glasses and prepared to read the verdict. The weight of the moment was unbearable. Bill Gaither sat motionless, his hands gripping the arms of his chair as if bracing for impact. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind racing through every possibility. Would he walk out of this courtroom a free man? Or was this the day his legacy would be permanently stained? The judge cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. The entire gospel world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the next words that would define Bill Gaither's future. Gloria sat nearby, her fingers intertwined, lips moving in a silent prayer. The room felt impossibly small, the walls closing in as every eye remained locked on the man behind the bench. This court has reviewed all evidence, testimonies, and arguments presented. Judge Harrison began, his voice steady but firmly. Acknowledge the contributions of Mr. Gaither to the music industry, his influence on millions, and the impact of his work. However, the charges brought forth cannot be ignored. Murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Bill felt a lump rise in his throat, his breathing shallow. He wasn't naive, he knew this was serious, but hearing it spoken aloud made it all the more real. The judge continued, his tone unwavering. It is the decision of this James Gaither to 5 years in federal custody along with financial penalties, as deemed appropriate. The gavel struck, sealing his fate. The sound was deafening, final, irreversible. Bill's stomach dropped. He exhaled sharply, his hands gripping his knees to keep from shaking. His ears rang, drowning out the shocked reactions around him. 5 years, the words replayed over and over in his mind. 5 years away from his family, 5 years away from his music, 5 years where he would be nothing more than another name in a system that had no concern for who he had been before. Gloria let out a soft sob, barely audible beneath the murmuring crowd. The reality of it hit her too. Bill turned his head slightly, catching the broken expression on her face. It was harder to bear than the sentence itself. The prosecution remained expressionless, while the defense team exchanged glances, their faces etched with a mix of disappointment and determination. There was talk of appeals, of pushing for a lesser sentence, but at this moment those were just words. The verdict had been spoken somewhere in the courtroom. A journalist was already typing the headline that would flood social media within seconds. Gospel legend Bill Gaither sentenced to fall from grace. He could see it now, splashed across news sites, debated endlessly on talk shows, twisted and reshaped until the truth barely mattered anymore. Security approached, ready to escort him away. Bill inhaled deeply, straightened his posture, and stood. If this was how it was going to be, he wouldn't allow them to see him break. He had spent his life preaching faith through hardship. Now he had no choice but to live those words himself. The judge had spoken, the world was watching, and the gospel community would never be the same. Well, in your song I didn't see any redemption. All I saw was a chance to get a laugh from the audience, and to me it was a cheap laugh from the audience. How would you have felt had you been the parents of a homosexual child who said to you that day, you know, that he was gay, or the daughter was a lesbian? How would you felt about that had you had somebody up there making fun of your son, daughters in a Christian context? I would have felt very good about it, and you offer no grace, no redemption to them. If you're serious about that subject, why don't you go to school and do some studying of theology? See how the scripture deals with it, some philosophy, some psychology, and address the subject seriously as you feel. God is telling you to address the subject, but don't do it in a context that would be hurtful. But that's men down on Christian stages. Family and fan reaction, shock, loyalty, and betrayal. The moment the judge's gavel struck, sending its final echoing crack through the courtroom, the reality of the situation finally sank in for everyone present. Bill Gaither, an icon of gospel music, a man who had built an empire on faith, family, and the power of music, was now a convicted man. The words of the verdict still hung in the air, like a fog that refused to lift, heavy and suffocating. But while the courtroom held a stunned silence, the world outside was anything but quiet. The first Reaction came from the people closest to him, his family, Gloria Gaither, his wife, and lifelong partner in both music and faith, sat frozen in place, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. She had been holding on to hope until the very last second, believing that somehow, someway, things wouldn't come to this, but now, with Bill's fate sealed, all she could do was stare at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain, disbelief, and an almost desperate determination. Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. Not here, not now. Instead, she took a deep breath, straightened her back, and reached for Bill's hand as he stood to be escorted away. He squeezed it gently, the only way he could silently reassure her. I don't think you can do major surgery on a public stage, and some of the issues are major, serious issues. So if you're going to do major, serious surgery on a public stage, you better make sure that you can cut the patient totally open, get out all the toxic poisons and everything, and sew him back up. Just don't open them up and say, okay, preachers, you take care of this mess that I've just made. Some subjects are so tough that the only way you can deal on with them is not only you can't deal with it with 3,000 people sitting out there, they're so tough you can't even deal with 300, and maybe not even 30, because to this person he will accept it on this level, and this person will say, well, that doesn't apply to me. Some issues are so tough that you need to deal with one unknown. Let's take a serious issue like divorce. Divorce is terrible, you know, we all, none of us like divorce, but sometimes it happens, and it happens in the Christian church now. Rather than make a blanket statement about divorce, we have to think too carefully. It takes two people to make a marriage, and the one person didn't want to be married. The poor my sister went through a divorce. I don't think she had any choice. My brother went through a divorce. I thank God that no, I'm still married to the same woman I married to 53 years ago. I'm grateful for that, but I'm not going to put a guilt trip on somebody who did everything he do, and I know many people. Then there were the fans, millions of them scattered across the world, people who had looked up to Bill Gaither as a spiritual guide, a mentor, a voice of comfort in their darkest moments. For years his music had been a source of healing, of strength, and now in the wake of his conviction, his supporters found themselves grappling with emotions they never expected to feel. Social media exploded within minutes of the verdict. Hashtags like Justice for Gaither and Gospel Scandal began trending, with passionate debates flooding comment sections and online forums. Bill Gaither is a man of God. This is a witch hunt, one fan wrote on Twitter, their post gaining thousands of likes in minutes. Another wasn't so sure. I grew up listening to his music. I don't even know what to think anymore. If the court found him guilty, does that mean he was never the man we believed he was? The division was stark. Some fans stood by him without hesitation, convinced that he was being unfairly targeted. Others felt betrayed, struggling to reconcile the man they had admired with the charges he now faced. Gospel radio stations debated whether to continue playing his music. Some pulled his songs from their rotation. Bill was always the leader, always the one guiding the group. I never questioned him, but looking back, maybe I should have. The weight of those words sent shock waves through the community as Bill sat in the holding cell waiting for the next steps in the process. He knew his world had changed forever. He had spent his life lifting people up through faith and music, but now as he stared at the cold gray walls around him, he realized that faith alone wouldn't be enough to fix this. The trust of his fans had been shaken, his family was hurting, and the gospel world would never be the